Okay, in this section, we are going to think about multiplication of fractions in 3 different ways. First, multiplying 2 fractions, then multiplying a fraction times a whole number, and then figuring out what might fraction multiplication look like if we're thinking about fraction in terms of area of a rectangle. Let's do the first one, multiplication of 2 fractions. This is usually the entry point for students in terms of multiplication of fractions. And I know that all of you are already thinking, just multiply the numerators, just multiply the denominators. I know that you're thinking about that, all right? And you might say, Sarah, that's all students need to know. Well, we are really going to focus on multiplication of fractions in terms of conceptually what's going on. And here's why. Most students can multiply fractions procedurally. But where students run into difficulty with multiplication of fractions is when they have to decide for themselves, well, what am I going to do here? And often that comes through word problems. They'll read a word problem and they'll be like, I don't know. Do I need to add, subtract, multiply, or divide? If you understood conceptually what multiplication of fractions means, it would be much easier for you to decide what to do in that word problem and be able to go and do it. So I'm not going to talk about the procedures here, but I am going to talk about the concepts. And to do that, we're going to use a lot of visuals. And so you know what? I need to scram so you can see the entire screen. Here we go. Here I'm going to do 1/2 times 3/4. First, I'm going to really think about what this problem is asking me. I need to multiply 1/2 times 3/4. But it's better if I think about this as I need to figure out 1/2 of 3/4. I really like to interpret that multiplication sign as of. That's going to help students with this interpretation. So if I'm finding 1/2 of 3/4, the first thing I'm going to do is identify and represent the second factor. Here the second factor is 3/4, and I'm going to represent 3/4 as 3 1/4 pieces. Then I'm going to identify the first factor. The first factor is 1/2. I'm going to identify it. I'm not going to represent it. Notice how it doesn't say and represent. But now I think I have to find 1/2 of 3/4, or I could think about that as 1/2 of each unit fraction of the second factor. So there I see 3/4 has 3 unit fractions, 1/4, 1/4, 1/4, and I'm going to find 1/2 of each of those unit fractions. So here's 1/2 of 1/4, second 1/2 of 1/4, a third 1/2 of 1/4. But if I am finding 1/2 of each of these 1/4 pieces, I also have to do that there at the end. Remember, I'm not working with 4/4, I'm only working with 3/4. But this is going to allow me to see that I now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 equal parts. That's going to help with my denominator. And then 1/2 of those 3 1/4 pieces are the blue things. That's 1/8, 1/8, and 1/8. So 1/2 times 3/4 equals 3/8. There are different approaches to showing multiplication of fractions, but I went with the approach of thinking about each unit fraction and the fraction of the first factor of the second factor. Now, I did that because that's often going to be easiest for students if they're drawing this multiplication of fractions. So let me do a drawing right here to show you what I mean. So I'm going to think about 2/3 of 4/5. So that means I'm going to identify the second factor and I'm going to show 4/5. I'll go ahead and show this here. I'm going to end up, let's see, 4/5. Let's try to equally divide this. Oh, wow, Sarah, that was pretty good. All right, and I'm going to show 4/5. I'm going to shade those in like that. Okay, that's looking pretty good so far. All righty, okay. Now I'm going to move over here and grab a different color marker so I can now think about 2/3 of 4/5. So with each of these 1/5 pieces, I'm going to divide it in 2/3. And I'm going to do that here using my blue marker, and I'm going to draw some horizontal lines there. And then I'm going to shade over that. This is 1/3 of that, the 2/3 of that. But I'm not going to shade that right there, right? Because that's not 2/3. That would be 3/3. I only want 2/3. Then I'm going to do the same thing for this 1/5 piece. There's 1/3 of it, 2/3 of it. I'm going to do it for this 1/3 piece, 1/3 of that, 2/3 now. I keep going. 1/3 of that, 2/3. And then I'm going to divide this last, this is like basically just a place value holder for 1/5. I'm going to also divide that into thirds, but I'm not going to do any shading, right? Because that's actually not part of my fraction that's in play. So 2/3 times 4/5. What denominator have we created? Well, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 equal parts. So I'm going to go ahead and write 15 right there. And then when I found 2/3 of each of those 4/5 pieces, that was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 of those equal parts. I'll go ahead and write my 8 right there. Now I know you're multiplying the numerators and multiplying the denominators, but what I did right there was show you what that multiplication actually means. And that is going to be usually a really easy approach for students, is taking each of those unit fractions and finding the first factor or first fraction of the second fraction. Let's look at another example, but this time, instead of thinking about that length model, let's use some two-color counters. Let's see what it looks like. First, we're going to identify and represent the second factor. Here in this problem, the second factor is 2/5, so I'm going to show 2/5 with my two-color counters. This time I'm using those virtual two-color counters. So in this set of 5, 2 are red, and the other 3 yellow are holding place to hold that set of 5. Then I'm going to identify the first factor. I think to myself, well, I have to find 1/4 of each of those 1/5 pieces, of which I have 2/5 in this problem. So I'm going to figure out, well, what is 1/4 of each of these two-color counters? That means I'm going to divide this counter into 4 equal parts, that counter into 4 equal parts, but I'm going to continue. That yellow counter will be divided into 4 equal parts, this one into 4 equal parts, and that one into 4 equal parts. So now I can quickly see I'm working with a denominator of 20. Now let's focus back on those red counters. Those are the two 1/5 counters that I want to focus on. So I'm going to find 1/4 of each of those. So I could shade that in. There's 1/4 of that red counter. Here's 1/4 of that red counter. So how many, I'll say, how many equal parts did I shade? I shaded 2, but then my denominator is 20. So when I multiply 1/4 times 2/5, my product is 2/20. Now some people like to use arrays to help students understand multiplication of two fractions. Let me show you an example for this problem, 2/3 times 3/4. So the first thing I'm going to do is identify and represent the second factor. Here the second factor is 3/4, so I'm going to show 3/4 within this area or array as 1, 2, 3 of those 4 equal parts. So they're shaded in yellow, and I want you to focus on those 3/4 parts that are yellow. Then I'm going to identify the first factor. In this example, it's 2/3. And if I'm doing this method, I'm also going to show 2/3. So I'm going to now move about 90 degrees within my array, and I'm going to show 2/3 with my horizontal lines, 1, 2, and then 3. So I've divided that into 3 equal parts, and I've shaded 2 of the 3 parts. So then what is the area that's basically doubly shaded? Well, that is the area in the top left-hand corner of this array. So I can see the part that is doubly shaded is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 equal parts out of 12 parts total. So 2/3 times 3/4 equals 6/12. And I think this is a nice thing to help students understand what multiplication means although sometimes it's a little bit harder for students to draw this. So you need to consider whether this is an approach that you'll want your students to practice. So it's time for activity 7. Here you are going to explore multiplication of fractions. We've provided 2 fractions for you to practice. You get to generate the next 2. But think about what are your visuals, hands-on tools, virtual manipulatives, or drawings that you will use to help students understand multiplication of fractions.